He thought he had already seen every kind of betrayal money could buy. But nothing prepared Korea's most feared mafia boss for the moment he saw his mother asleep on the shoulder of a poor black woman inside a freezing subway station. The first snow of December drifted slowly over Seoul like ash from a dying fire, covering the streets in a pale silver glow while black luxury sedans lined the avenue outside Gangnam Central Station. Red and blue emergency lights reflected against the wet pavement. Men in dark overcoats moved through the crowd with sharp eyes and hidden earpieces, their polished shoes splashing through slush as panic quietly spread beneath their controlled expressions. For 4 hours, Madame Han Soo-yeon had vanished without a trace. The elderly mother of Kang Min-jae, the man newspapers called the White Wolf of Gangnam, had disappeared from one of the most heavily guarded estates in South Korea. And when powerful people panic, entire cities begin to tremble. Min-jae stepped out of the back seat of his matte black Maybach with the stillness of a man used to obedience. Snowflakes melted against his dark coat without receiving any attention from him. At 39 years old, Kang Min-jae carried the kind of silence that made other men lower their eyes. He did not yell. He did not rush. He simply looked, and people moved. A station manager bowed nervously as security teams flooded the subway entrances. Reporters had already begun gathering behind barricades, whispering theories into cameras. Some claimed Madame Han had dementia. Others suggested kidnapping. But Min-jae ignored all of them. His jaw tightened as one of his men approached quickly and spoke in a low voice. "Boss, they found her." The world seemed to pause for half a breath. Min-jae turned toward the lower stairwell leading into the station. Cold fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he descended slowly into the underground terminal. The smell of wet concrete and burnt coffee drifted through the air. A violinist played softly near the ticket gates while exhausted commuters shuffled past with tired eyes and frozen hands. Then Min-jae stopped walking. 30 feet away, near a cracked vending machine beside track 4, his mother sat wrapped in an oversized gray coat. Her eyes were closed peacefully. Her frail body leaned gently against the shoulder of a black woman wearing worn sneakers and a thin brown jacket that clearly wasn't warm enough for winter. A paper cup of instant ramen rested beside her feet. One gloved hand carefully covered Madame Han's trembling fingers to keep them warm. The woman herself looked exhausted, but she remained completely still so the old woman could sleep comfortably against her shoulder. Min-jae stared without blinking. Around them, whispers had already begun. "Who is she? She must be using the old lady. Look at her clothes. Probably after money." A pair of transit officers approached cautiously while one of Min-jae's bodyguards instinctively stepped forward, prepared to separate them. But before anyone could touch her, Madame Han suddenly tightened her grip around the woman's arm like a frightened child protecting the only thing she trusted. And then, in a weak, trembling voice that shattered something deep inside her son, the old woman whispered, "Please, don't make her leave me." The station fell strangely quiet. Snow continued falling outside the glass entrance above them, while Kang Min-jae stood frozen beneath the harsh subway lights, staring at the poor black woman his mother refused to let go of. And for the first time in many years, the most feared man in Seoul looked completely unprepared for what he was feeling. The moment Madame Han whispered those trembling words, the atmosphere inside the subway station changed completely. Even the commuters rushing toward the late-night trains seemed to slow down as if they could feel the tension hanging in the cold air. Kang Min-jae stood motionless beneath the fluorescent lights while snow melted quietly on the shoulders of his black overcoat. His bodyguards waited for a command that never came. Nobody in Seoul was used to seeing him hesitate. Not his enemies. Not his employees. Not even his own family. Yet there he was, staring at the exhausted black woman beside his mother as though he could not understand what he was seeing. Amara Johnson slowly lifted her eyes toward him. They were tired eyes, cautious but calm, the eyes of someone who had learned long ago that dignity was often the only thing poor people truly owned. She gently adjusted the scarf around Madame Han's neck without saying a word. One of the transit officers stepped forward awkwardly. "Sir, we can remove her immediately if you want." Before Min-jae could answer, another voice cut through the station. "She has been here for hours pretending to help that old woman." A middle-aged woman holding a luxury shopping bag pointed openly at Amara with visible disgust. I saw her sitting next to her earlier. These scammers always target confused elderly people. Several people nearby nodded immediately. Phones were already raised. Someone had started recording. The whispers spread fast through the terminal like smoke. She probably wants money. Maybe she stole something. Why else would she stay? Amara lowered her eyes again. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. Instead, she carefully placed her paper coffee cup closer to Madame Han's hands so the old woman could feel its warmth. The simple gesture only seemed to irritate the crowd more. A young station employee approached with nervous authority. "Ma'am, you should step away from the elderly woman until security finishes questioning you." Madame Han suddenly tightened her grip around Amara's arm with surprising strength. Fear flooded the old woman's face. "No," she whispered shakily. "Do not leave me alone again." The station employee froze awkwardly while uncomfortable silence spread through the group. Min-jae's jaw tightened slightly. His mother had not spoken that clearly to him in weeks. Since her memory had begun fading, conversations with her often drifted into confusion and silence. But now, holding on to this stranger, Madame Han sounded terrified of losing her. One of Min-jae's senior guards leaned closer and quietly muttered, "Boss, this does not look right. We should separate them and investigate the woman privately." Min-jae did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Amara. Her coat sleeves were worn at the edges. Snow had dampened the knees of her jeans. Her sneakers looked too thin for the freezing weather outside. Nothing about her suggested manipulation. Nothing about her looked calculated. And yet years inside the criminal underworld had trained him never to trust appearances. Nearby, a teenage boy laughed softly while filming with his phone. "This is insane. The old lady trusts her more than her own family." The words landed harder than anyone realized. Madame Han slowly opened her eyes again and looked up at Amara with childlike exhaustion. "Did you eat yet?" she asked softly. Amara smiled faintly despite the humiliation surrounding her. "Not yet, ma'am," she answered gently. "But you finished your soup, and that matters more." Min-jae felt something unfamiliar move quietly through the cold emptiness inside his chest. Around him, powerful men waited for orders while strangers kept whispering cruel assumptions about the poor black woman sitting beside his mother. But Amara Johnson never once tried to defend herself. She only stayed exactly where she was, allowing an elderly, frightened woman to lean against her shoulder beneath the harsh lights of a freezing Seoul subway station. Some people reveal who they are when they gain power, but others reveal who they are when nobody important is watching them. The black sedans moved silently through the sleeping streets of Seoul as snow continued falling over the city like soft white dust. Inside the lead vehicle, the heater hummed quietly while Kang Min-jae sat motionless beside the window, watching the blurred lights of Gangnam slide across the glass. Across from him, Madame Han rested peacefully beneath a cashmere blanket, finally asleep after hours of confusion and fear. Yet even now, her frail fingers still clung weakly to the sleeve of the brown jacket draped over her lap. Amara Johnson sat near the opposite door with her hands folded quietly together. She looked exhausted beneath the harsh interior lighting of the car. Damp curls rested against her cheeks from the melting snow, and her worn sneakers left traces of slush on the expensive floor mats. No one inside the vehicle spoke. The silence itself felt heavy. Finally, one of Min-jae's senior guards leaned closer and whispered, "Carefully, boss, we checked nearby surveillance." The woman first approached Madame Han around 6:30 this evening outside a pharmacy in Itaewon. Min-jae said nothing. The guard continued cautiously. "Your mother appeared disoriented. She had wandered several blocks alone before this woman noticed her." Another tablet screen illuminated inside the dark car. Security footage began playing silently. Grainy black and white video showed Madame Han standing confused near a crosswalk while crowds passed around her without stopping. Some glanced briefly before continuing on. Then Amara appeared on screen carrying 2 grocery bags and an old umbrella. She stopped immediately when she noticed the elderly woman trembling beside the traffic light. The footage showed her removing her own scarf and gently wrapping it around Madame Han's shoulders before guiding her carefully away from the freezing sidewalk. Min-jae watched without blinking. The second video came from a convenience store. Madame Han sat near the heater while Amara purchased hot soup and tea using crumpled bills and loose coins. She counted every dollar carefully before handing over the money. The cashier appeared impatient, but Amara still smiled politely before carrying the tray back to Madame Han. In the reflection of the security camera, Min-jae noticed something strange. Amara herself never ate anything. "Keep playing," he said quietly. More footage appeared. In one clip, Amara patiently tied Madame Han's loose shoelace while commuters stepped around them in irritation. In another, she sat beside her for nearly an hour inside the subway station, while repeatedly trying to contact emergency services using an outdated cell phone with a cracked screen. No attempts to access bank accounts, one guard reported carefully. No theft, no suspicious calls, nothing. Min-jae slowly leaned back against the leather seat. For years, he had survived by assuming kindness always came with hidden motives. In his world, loyalty was rented, not given freely. Even family members often wanted something in return. Yet this woman had spent hours protecting his vulnerable mother without asking for money, recognition, or help. Madame Han suddenly stirred softly in her sleep. Her tired eyes opened halfway before drifting toward Amara. "Angel," she whispered weakly. "You stayed." The word hung quietly inside the vehicle. Amara lowered her eyes with visible discomfort, almost embarrassed by the affection. "Try to rest, ma'am," she answered gently. "You are safe now." Min-jae felt an unfamiliar tightness settle deep in his chest. Nobody had called his mother safe in a very long time. Guards protected her. Doctors monitored her. Employees obeyed her. But safety was something entirely different. Outside, snow continued falling across Seoul, while the city slept beneath towers of glass and wealth. And inside the warm silence of a luxury car, Korea's most feared mafia boss began questioning whether the poorest person in the room might also be the most genuine. The truth about a person is rarely hidden in their words. It hides inside the small things they do when nobody important is looking. Nearly 2 hours later, the massive iron gates of the Han estate slowly opened beneath the falling snow. The mansion stood above Seoul like a palace carved from glass and stone, its warm golden lights glowing against the freezing winter night. Luxury cars lined the curved driveway while security guards moved with disciplined silence across the property. Amara Johnson stepped out of the Maybach carefully, clearly uncomfortable beneath the attention surrounding her. Her thin jacket looked painfully out of place beside the polished marble entrance and towering crystal chandeliers visible through the glass doors. One of the house staff members immediately frowned at the sight of her worn clothes and damp shoes, but lowered his head the moment Kong Min-jae approached. Madame Han remained asleep upstairs under medical supervision, while doctors quietly entered and exited the estate carrying leather cases and tablets. Meanwhile, Min-jae stood inside his private office overlooking the city skyline, listening as information about Amara slowly unfolded piece by piece across the large screen mounted against the wall. Amara Johnson, 42 years old, originally from Atlanta, Georgia. One of his investigators spoke calmly while digital records appeared. Former certified nursing assistant. Arrived in South Korea 4 years ago on a caregiver work program. Min-jae remained silent, one hand resting near a glass of untouched whiskey. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No suspicious financial activity. Another file appeared on screen. Hospital employment records. Shelter addresses. Immigration renewals. Small temporary jobs. Nothing impressive. Nothing powerful. Just survival. "Continue," Min-jae said quietly. The investigator hesitated briefly before opening another document. Her son passed away 11 years ago during a convenience store robbery in Atlanta. The room became still. Snow drifted quietly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows while nobody inside dared speak carelessly. After that, the investigator continued softly. She left nursing for almost 3 years. Psychological records indicate severe depression and social withdrawal. Eventually, she returned to caregiving work. A photograph appeared on screen. Younger Amara stood beside an elderly patient in a wheelchair, smiling warmly despite visible exhaustion in her eyes. Another image showed her helping at a community shelter kitchen. Another showed her carrying grocery bags for an elderly neighbor during winter. No cameras. No audience. Just quiet acts of kindness repeated over and over through the years. Min-jae stared at the screen longer than expected. In his world, people performed generosity when money or influence could be gained from it. But this woman had spent years giving pieces of herself away without recognition. A soft knock interrupted the silence. One of the housemaids entered carefully. "Sir," she said nervously, "your mother is awake." Min-jae walked upstairs through the long, dim hallway lined with expensive artwork and silent security personnel. When he reached Madame Han's room, he stopped at the doorway. His mother sat upright in bed beneath soft lighting, her silver hair slightly messy against the pillows. And beside her, quietly helping her hold a warm cup of tea, sat Amara Johnson. Madame Han looked calmer than she had in months. Her trembling hands had steadied. Even her breathing sounded lighter. "There she is," the old woman whispered softly when she noticed Min-jae standing nearby. But she was not looking at her son. She was smiling at Amara. The room fell silent for several long seconds while warm light spilled gently across the blankets, and snow continued falling outside the dark windows of the mansion. And somewhere deep beneath years of suspicion and emotional distance, Kang Min-jae began realizing that the poorest woman who had ever entered his home might possess something money had failed to buy for his family in years. Sometimes the people losing their memories can still recognize the one soul who makes them feel less alone. Morning arrived slowly over Seoul beneath pale winter sunlight and low gray clouds drifting between the skyscrapers. Inside the Han estate, silence moved through the marble hallways like something sacred. Staff members spoke softly. Security guards lowered their voices. Even the doctors seemed unusually careful as they crossed the upper floor carrying reports and medication trays. Something inside the mansion had shifted overnight. Kang Min-jae stood alone near the dining room windows, watching snow slide gently from the pine trees outside the estate walls. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the subway station again. His mother clinging to Amara Johnson's arm. The fear in her trembling voice. The trust. A senior physician approached carefully beside him. "Sir," the doctor said quietly, "your mother has been more responsive this morning than she has been in months." Min-jae looked over slowly. "What changed?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "She appears calmer whenever Miss Johnson is nearby." Those words stayed with him long after the doctor walked away. Around noon, Min-jae entered his mother's private sitting room upstairs. Warm sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors while soft classical music played from an old speaker near the bookshelf. Madame Han sat near the fireplace wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. Across from her, Amara carefully peeled an orange and separated each slice onto a small porcelain plate. The scene felt strangely peaceful. Human. Madame Han smiled faintly. The moment she noticed her son. "Min-jae," she whispered. "Come sit with us." He obeyed quietly, lowering himself into the chair beside them. For several moments nobody spoke. The fireplace crackled softly while snow drifted outside the tall windows. Then Madame Han suddenly reached for Amara's hand. "Do you know what she did for me last night?" the old woman asked softly. Min-jae remained still. She listened. The room grew silent. Madame Han stared down at their joined hands as though searching through fading memories. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes I forget where I am. Sometimes I forget what year it is." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stayed beside me like I still mattered. Min-jae looked toward Amara. She lowered her eyes modestly. "Anyone would have helped her," she said gently. But both of them knew that was not true. The old woman slowly shook her head. "No," Madame Han whispered. Most people looked away. The words settled heavily into the room. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows while somewhere deeper in the mansion expensive clocks ticked through the afternoon in perfect rhythm. Madame Han suddenly smiled again, faint but sincere. "When your father was alive," she murmured weakly, "he used to say you can learn everything about a person by how they treat the lonely." Min-jae's expression shifted almost invisibly at the mention of his father. Amara carefully handed the elderly woman another slice of orange before adjusting the blanket around her shoulders with quiet patience. Such a small gesture. Yet Min-jae noticed his mother relax immediately beneath her touch. Not because of medicine, not because of wealth, simply because someone genuinely cared whether she felt cold. And for the first time in years, Kang Min-jae began noticing something painful hidden beneath the luxury surrounding his family. His mother had spent her final healthy years surrounded by servants, doctors, security, and endless comfort. Yet somehow, she had still been unbearably alone. until a poor black woman with worn shoes and tired eyes sat beside her in a freezing subway station and treated her like she was worth staying for. Wealth can hide loneliness beautifully, but eventually the truth always sits down at the table with everyone else. 3 nights later, the Han estate glowed like a palace against the winter darkness as black luxury cars rolled steadily through the front gates beneath falling snow. Seoul's elite had gathered inside for one of Kang Min-jae's annual private dinners, an invitation so exclusive that politicians, executives, and celebrities waited months hoping to receive one. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom in warm gold, while violin music drifted softly through the air. Women in designer gowns moved gracefully across polished marble floors beside men wearing tailored suits worth more than most people earned in a year. Expensive laughter filled the room like practiced music. Yet beneath all the elegance, there was tension, because rumors had already begun spreading through Seoul society. Rumors about the mysterious black woman seen entering the Han estate several times that week. Min-jae stood near the center of the ballroom, speaking calmly with investors, while security remained positioned discreetly along the walls. His expression remained unreadable as always. But several guests kept glancing toward the staircase with visible curiosity. Then the room slowly quieted. Madame Han appeared at the top of the stairs wearing a silver-gray dress beneath a cream shawl. Her health still looked fragile, but tonight there was unexpected life in her eyes. Beside her stood Amara Johnson in a simple dark blue dress provided by the household staff. It was elegant but modest, and despite her nervous posture, she carried herself with quiet dignity that could not be purchased or taught. Conversations immediately shifted into whispers. Some guests looked surprised. Others looked openly uncomfortable. One wealthy socialite leaned toward her companion and muttered just loudly enough to be heard nearby. "I suppose charity work has become part of the entertainment now." A few restrained laughs followed. Another woman examined Amara coldly before saying, "She certainly adapted quickly for someone picked up in a subway station." Amara heard every word. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, but she kept walking beside Madame Han without reacting. The old woman, however, tightened her grip around Amara's hand. Min-jae noticed immediately. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the polished floor as hundreds of eyes followed them toward the main dining area. Long tables decorated with white roses and candlelight stretched beneath enormous crystal fixtures overhead. Staff members pulled chairs back carefully as guests prepared to sit. Then another uncomfortable moment arrived. One of the senior event coordinators approached discreetly and whispered to Amara, "Ma'am, staff seating is arranged separately downstairs." Before Amara could answer, Madame Han spoke first. "No." Her voice was soft but clear enough to silence the nearest conversations. The old woman slowly turned toward the coordinator. "She sits with me." The coordinator froze. Several guests exchanged awkward glances while the violin music continued quietly in the background. Amara immediately shook her head politely. "It is all right," she said gently. "I do not want to cause trouble." But Madame Han refused to release her hand. "You are not trouble," the old woman whispered. The room grew still again. Kang Min-jae stood watching from across the ballroom, his dark eyes moving slowly over the faces of his guests. He saw the judgment, the discomfort, the carefully hidden arrogance. And suddenly, for the first time in years, the entire performance of wealth surrounding him felt strangely empty. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke. "Prepare another chair beside my mother." The ballroom went silent. No one moved at first. Some guests looked genuinely stunned. Others lowered their eyes immediately. Amara herself looked shocked. But Min-jae never looked away from the crowd around him as the chair was quietly placed beside Madame Han at the center of the table. In that moment, beneath the golden chandeliers and the silent pressure of Seoul's most powerful people, a poor black woman was treated with more respect than many of them had ever shown another human being in their lives. Respect becomes uncomfortable for cruel people the moment it is given to someone they believe stands beneath them. The dinner continued beneath golden chandelier light, while snow pressed softly against the tall ballroom windows overlooking Seoul. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight across the long dining table where politicians, executives, and celebrities now sat in uneasy silence. At the center of it all, beside Madame Han, sat Amara Johnson. She held herself carefully, almost trying to disappear despite being impossible to ignore. Every polished movement around her seemed designed to remind her she did not belong there. Yet Madame Han continued smiling peacefully beside her, as though the woman everyone judged so quickly had become the only comforting thing left in her fading world. Courses of expensive food arrived one after another, while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Still, the atmosphere remained strained. Some guests avoided looking directly at Amara. Others watched her constantly with thinly disguised curiosity. Across the table, one businessman quietly asked another if Min Jae had hired her as a caretaker. A woman beside them responded coldly. People become emotional when they grow lonely. Even powerful men. Min Jae heard every whisper, but he said nothing. Instead, he studied Amara carefully throughout the evening. She never touched the expensive wine. She thanked every server politely. When Madame Han struggled slightly lifting her spoon, Amara adjusted the plate without drawing attention to it. Small gestures. Quiet gestures. The kind most wealthy people stopped noticing because they had not needed tenderness in years. Then the moment arrived that changed everything. Dessert had just been served when Madame Han suddenly became unusually alert. Her cloudy eyes moved slowly across the ballroom, as though a rare moment of clarity had broken through the fog, consuming her memory. The old woman looked toward Min Jae first. "Do you remember what your father used to say?" she asked softly. The entire table grew quiet. Min Jae lowered his fork carefully. "Which part?" Madame Han smiled faintly. "That money can buy service, but never sincerity." Silence spread across the ballroom. Even the staff stopped moving. Then the old woman slowly turned toward Amara beside her and gently took her hand. "This woman stayed with me when nobody had to," Madame Han whispered. "Not because she feared us. Not because she wanted something. She stayed because she saw an old woman alone." Several guests immediately lowered their eyes. The shame in the room became almost physical. Madame Han looked back at her son again, and for the first time that evening, emotion appeared openly in her tired voice. "Min Jae," she said softly, "when my memory disappears completely one day, promise me something." He stared at her silently. "Do not become the kind of rich man who forgets how to see people." The words landed harder than any threat he had ever received in his life. Around him sat some of the most powerful individuals in Seoul, people who feared his name, respected his influence, envied his wealth. Yet in that moment, none of it protected him from the quiet truth spoken by his aging mother. Across the table, Amara gently squeezed Madame Han's trembling hand and whispered, "You should rest now, ma'am." There was no performance in her voice, no ambition, no calculation, just kindness spoken softly into a room full of people who suddenly realized how poor their hearts had become. Kang Min Jae slowly leaned back in his chair while candlelight flickered across the crystal glasses and expensive silverware surrounding him. And for the first time in many years, the most feared man in Seoul felt smaller than the woman everyone else at the table had looked down on. The strongest people are often the ones who quietly hold others together while nobody notices they are falling apart themselves. The snowstorm arrived after midnight. Thick white flakes swept across Seoul beneath freezing wind, while traffic lights blurred behind curtains of ice and slush. Inside the Han estate, most of the staff had already gone to sleep when panic suddenly shattered the silence. One of the upstairs nurses rushed breathlessly through the hallway, while security alarms quietly activated throughout the property. Madame Han was gone again. Kang Min Jae came down the staircase immediately, still wearing a black sweater and dark slacks, his expression colder than the winter outside. "How long?" he demanded. 10 minutes, maybe 15, one guard answered nervously. The east hallway camera malfunctioned during the storm. Min Jae's jaw tightened. Within seconds, black SUVs began pulling out of the estate while teams spread through nearby streets searching parks, bus stops, pharmacies, and subway entrances. Snow hammered against windshields as Seoul disappeared beneath the storm. Yet amid all the chaos, one person remained strangely calm. Amara Johnson stood near the mansion entrance pulling on her worn gloves while icy wind swept snow through the open doorway. "Where are you going?" one house employee asked anxiously. Amara looked toward the storm-covered road. "She told me something earlier tonight," she answered quietly. "She said she missed hearing the church bells near the river." Min Jae immediately looked up at her. The old cathedral in Mapo, he said under his breath. Without waiting another second, he grabbed his coat and followed her outside. The drive through the storm felt endless. Snow covered the streets so heavily that even the luxury vehicles moved carefully across the icy pavement. Wind rattled against the windows while emergency lights reflected through the darkness. Finally, near the riverfront district, the distant sound of church bells echoed softly through the storm. Amara stepped out of the vehicle before security could stop her. Snow immediately coated her hair and shoulders as she hurried down the nearly empty sidewalk beside the frozen river walk. Then she saw her. Madame Han sat alone beneath an old bus shelter near the cathedral gates, shivering violently beneath the falling snow. Her thin coat was dusted white, and confusion filled her tired eyes as strangers passed without stopping. But the moment she saw Amara running toward her through the storm, relief flooded the old woman's face. "You came," Madame Han whispered weakly. Amara dropped beside her immediately, wrapping her own coat around the trembling woman despite the brutal cold. "Of course I came," she said softly. "You should never sit out here alone." Moments later, black SUVs arrived behind them while guards rushed forward through the snow. Kong Min-jae stepped out into the freezing wind and froze at the sight before him. Amara sat on the icy bench holding his frightened mother tightly against her chest, while snow covered both of them beneath the dim yellow glow of the bus stop light. Madame Han looked safer in that woman's arms than she ever had inside the guarded walls of his mansion. The old woman reached weakly toward her son. "She found me," Madame Han whispered. Min-jae stared at Amara for several long seconds while snow melted across his dark hair and shoulders. Then, slowly, something happened that none of his guards had ever witnessed before. The feared white wolf of Gangnam lowered himself onto one knee directly in front of a poor black woman sitting inside a freezing bus shelter. His voice came out quieter than the falling snow around them. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The storm continued raging across Seoul while headlights glowed against the frozen streets behind them. But inside that small shelter beside the river, power itself had finally bowed its head before kindness. Not every act of justice arrives with punishment. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, when the world finally learns how to recognize the value of a human soul. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Seoul over the following weeks. Snow melted from sidewalks and rooftops while warmer sunlight returned to the city streets. Yet inside the Han estate, something far more important had changed. The atmosphere no longer felt cold. Staff members spoke more gently to one another. Security guards greeted elderly visitors with patience instead of indifference. Even the house employees who once looked down on Amara Johnson now lowered their eyes respectfully whenever she passed through the halls beside Madame Han. Nobody announced the change aloud. It simply spread quietly from room to room, carried by example instead of fear. Kong Min-jae noticed everything. He noticed how his mother slept peacefully whenever Amara read softly beside her in the evenings. He noticed how the old woman laughed more often now, even during moments when her memory faded. Most painfully of all, he noticed how little warmth had existed inside his home before a poor black woman entered it carrying nothing except compassion and quiet dignity. One afternoon, reporters gathered outside a newly renovated building near the Han River as cameras flashed beneath bright spring sunlight. The elegant stone sign near the entrance read, "The Suyun Care Center." Rumors spread quickly through Seoul because the project had been funded entirely by Kong Min-jae himself, a free care facility for elderly people abandoned or neglected by their families. Nurses moved through the building preparing rooms filled with sunlight, bookshelves, flowers, and comfortable chairs facing the river. There were music rooms, reading lounges, warm kitchens that smelled like fresh soup and tea. Nothing inside felt cold or institutional. It felt human. During the opening ceremony, executives, politicians, and journalists gathered beneath white banners waiting for Min-jae to speak. But instead of standing behind the podium immediately, the feared white wolf of Gangnam remained strangely distracted, scanning the crowd quietly. Finally, one reporter stepped forward. "Chairman Kong," she asked carefully, "many people are wondering what inspired this project." The cameras turned toward him. For several seconds, Min-jae remained silent while spring wind moved gently across the courtyard. Then he answered simply, "Someone reminded me that loneliness can exist even inside beautiful homes." The crowd grew quiet. Another reporter asked, "Will the woman connected to your mother be joining the foundation?" Min-jae looked toward the empty chair reserved near the front row. But Amara Johnson never came to public events. She never asked for recognition. She never tried to benefit from the attention surrounding his family. That morning, before sunrise, she had quietly left the estate after checking once more on Madame Han, while the old woman slept peacefully by the window. No dramatic goodbye. No request for money. Only a handwritten note left beside the tea kettle in the kitchen. "Thank you for letting me care for her. Please remember to sit with her sometimes when she is afraid." Hours later, after the ceremony ended and the reporters disappeared, Kang Min-jae stood alone beside the river watching the evening sunlight reflect across the water. Then, in the distance, he saw a familiar figure near a crowded intersection. Amara Johnson stood patiently beside an elderly homeless woman struggling to cross the street with grocery bags. Cars rushed past. Most people ignored them. But Amara stayed beside the woman carefully, matching her slow steps one at a time beneath the fading golden light. She never noticed Min-jae watching from across the street. And somehow, that made the moment even more powerful. The most feared man in Seoul stood completely still while city noise moved around him like distant waves. Because after all the wealth, fear, influence, and power he had spent his life building, the greatest thing he had ever witnessed was still a tired woman choosing kindness when nobody was watching. And on that quiet spring evening beside the Han River, even power itself finally understood what true dignity looked like.